giving the update for COP-30 of the climate conference, the 30th climate conference, which is going to happen in Brazil from November 10 to 21st. As all of us know, that the Conference of Parties started in 95 in Berlin with the COP1 as a result of the UNFCCC coming into being, along with UNCBD, the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, and UNCCD, the UN Convention on Climate Desertification, combating desertification, in the Earth Summit in 1992. The three environmental agreements, global environmental agreements, came into being in 92. The first COP for the climate happened in 95 in Berlin. So 30 years down the line, we had several milestones, but the results are not much to show for the positive results for expectations, for hope. It's really not very positive. There are few turning points like the Kyoto in 97. They came out with a target of confining the greenhouse gas emissions within some limits and cutting down emissions by the rich countries at that point of time, which was very, very inadequate. At that point of time, the developing countries or so-called non-annex countries, because the rich and high emitting countries were listed in an annexure, which was called Annex 1 countries. So this was the situation for several years till around the Bali COP, where there was a Bali roadmap declared, and as per that, many countries, including developing countries, started developing their own climate action plans. And as a result, out of that 2007 COP, 2008, as we know, that the government of India came out with the National Action Plan on Climate Change, which was not really an action plan, which was some wishful statements, but that was a beginning. And as a follow-up of that, eight national missions or climate action missions came up, and the ninth mission was added later. So these are the follow-up from initial first few years of 15 years. And then the 15th COP was a very important one, which was designed to be a very important one in Copenhagen, COP15, and where it was expected that a final strong decision on both mitigation, that is phasing out fossil fuels or reducing emission as per the dictates of science, will be adopted. But ultimately this was subverted and this didn't happen. So the Copenhagen COP15 was really a very hyped one, supposed to be a turning point, but it failed on many, many expectations. The next COP was one very important one also in Cancun in Mexico, because that was the COP where the decision for climate finance, because most poorer countries, developing countries, were actually emphasizing much more on finance from the developed countries for their own, one, adaptation, second, changing their economies to low carbon economies, which is a demand, but the poorer countries very justifiably said they have no money. So within this framework, the developing countries, or the out of them, the poorer countries were pressurizing more for climate finance rather than actual cutting down of emission by developed countries and all high emitter. So that was the first COP where this decision was finalized. The first decision of COP16 was that climate finance, and as a result, the green finance is always set up. The mechanism was set up, which later on became an independent body with its headquarters in Seoul. So that was the start of climate finance. But from that point of time, climate finance in terms of grants also started flowing to developing countries. So these were the initial years up to 2009, 2010. Then there was a phase, because we know that 2008 economic collapse, global economic collapse, started in US but spread to all across the world, though India and other countries were comparatively less impacted. At that point of time, lot of these decisions started changing, because developing countries were demanding higher climate finance. Developed countries said the developing countries, some of the bigger countries have grown bigger and they are emitting much higher, like China, India, Indonesia, Mexico, Argentina. All of these countries have become much higher emitters. So they should also shoulder responsibilities. They are now major emitters. And as also they said, we cannot provide as much finance as you are saying. But this $100 billion per year, which was supposed to be operational from 2020, that figure stuck. Though even at that point of time, it was very well known. In fact, many calculations, even by the World Bank, by UNFCCC, showed that this was a very insufficient amount. But on the other hand, the crucial aspect of mitigation didn't progress much. In fact, the global emissions kept rising. Emissions by developed countries also kept rising as a group, though the EU has started reducing its emission significantly. Developing countries started increasing their emissions even faster, because some of the developing countries like India and China, in that phase, they had their economic growth phase, the faster economic growth phase. And all of this growth was basically based on coal and oil, mostly on coal, because China and India are very heavily dependent on coal. And as we know, coal is the most carbon emission intensive energy source out of all fossil fuels. So this was the scenario till around 2015, when the Paris Climate Summit happened, which was supposed to be a landmark agreement, the Paris Agreement, which was signed. One very positive feature of Paris Agreement was that the first time the uh, civil society movements, the people's movements, indigenous people's movements, all of them were demanding that 1.5 degrees Celsius goal is adopted as the official goal, because this was not there in the official text. Official text was focusing on 2 degrees Celsius, and many of the scientific studies were showing that 2 degree is too high a temperature rise, 2 degree above the pre-industrial temperature by 2100. That's the deadline. That's the benchmark. So that will be too high. So you cannot really go for that. So what we saw in Paris is that the agreement officially accepted 1.5 degrees Celsius as a official target in the text, in the officially adopted text, but as a desirable goal. It still says we'll limit the temperature rise well below 2 degrees Celsius, and make best efforts to keep the temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial. So this was an optional goal, but still it came into the official text. So that was a big win. The second is the Paris Agreement also uh, got into action the NDCs, or nationally developed determined contributions, which are every country or country government in a real sense, what they will do in the next few years. That is a plan that they are supposed to submit to the UNFCCC. And during the Paris Agreement, multiple nations, including India, submitted their first NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. In that, many other countries said that this is the first time that we will come into net zero. That means their emissions will be net zero carbon dioxide by 2050. Net zero means that they will still emit some, but they will do something by which they will sequester back or absorb back that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. This is a problematic position, but that was the first point, that many countries committed to a net zero emission by 2050. And let us also recall that IPCC has, though IPCC studies are quite conservative, IPCC has repeatedly emphasized that for global temperatures not to cross 2 degrees Celsius and destabilize many of the Earth systems, we must be reaching a net zero position, or a zero position they used to tell earlier, but later adopted to net zero by 2050 latest, not by 2050 as an option, by latest. And that science has now been improved quite a lot, and now we know that even if the world reach 20 net zero by 2050, which in any case it is not going to do, we are not going to achieve climate stabilization. So this is the history up to Paris, and Paris Agreement was really appreciated all across the world. But there were two, three other things that the Paris Agreement actually did, which damaged the progressive agenda. One, it officially admitted and institutionalized the market mechanism. The market mechanism originated in the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, but that was a flexible mechanism, a part of which was the market mechanism. Rest of it was compulsory reduction in terms of mitigation. The market mechanism says that if a country cannot reduce its emission by as much as they are supposed to do, then they can pay some other poorer country entities some money, and they can do something like plant some trees or something like that, and then that can be accounted for the paying country. So this is called a market mechanism. There are multiple mechanisms like carbon trading, etc., CDM, clean development mechanism, joint implementation, etc., etc. So we will not go into detail of that, but this market mechanism was institutionalized in the Paris Agreement in its Article 6.2 and 6.4. So this is a big point of disappointment for movements and civil society organizations which were progressive, which were pushing for a real reduction, not a market-based reduction can accounting, but this is basically a reduction accounting rather than a real reduction on either side. So these positives and negatives were both there in the Paris Agreement. And then we come to the next important agreement, important climate summit is Glasgow, COP26, which happened after COVID, after 1 year of postponement. It happened in Glasgow. So Glasgow came out with several announcements and programs. One of them was the global deforestation pledge, because though deforestation is not the major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, actually the most major contributor to greenhouse gas emission is fossil fuel burning. And in that, the largest share is power generation or electricity generation, then transport, agriculture, and then other industries. These four are the major, the biggest carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas generation. And then there are many other smaller sources like waste, methane from waste, and many other there's other sources of deforestation, etc. So deforestation is still not a very big source of carbon emission, but deforestation is also impacting the biodiversity loss at a very high rate. So deforestation, stopping deforestation was taken up as one of the primary goals in Glasgow, and there was a global deforestation pledge. Incidentally, India didn't sign it. There was also a methane pledge. Methane, as we know, is in the short run, in the 12 to 20 years time, where methane starts degenerating into carbon dioxide. Methane is 85 to 86 times as powerful as carbon dioxide. So it was thought that if we can address the large methane emissions and reduce them, then there is a much sharper effect, much quicker and sharper effect on addressing climate change, the global warming. So the global methane pledge was also announced in Glasgow. Again, India didn't sign it. So these were some of the major areas. Plus, in Glasgow and subsequent COPs, China and India also came out with their net zero declaration. China declared in the next year about 2060 they will achieve net zero, and India Prime Minister declared in the COP that will achieve net zero in 2070. Of course, let's also make it very clear that going into net zero itself is a doubtful concept, is a very questionable concept. It's not been shown that it is possible, but this is a concept being floated around to avoid the absolute zero emission scenario. So that's one big question. But even with that, going into net zero by 2060, 70, even by 50, as we see now, the climate systems, the global earth systems, they are not going to wait for that long. So now let's come to quickly to what are the major points in COP30, major points of negotiation in COP30, and what is the status of the climate system now. The most important points in COP30 is one, upgrading the ambition, because this is the time. COP 2025 is the deadline that all member countries of Paris Agreement, they have to submit their upgraded NDCs, the nationally determined contribution. Like every country government who has said this much we will do, now they have to upgrade that. That means we call it increase the ambition. You will have to do more. You have to include more action in your NDC and submit it. And the deadline is this year, 2025. Many countries have submitted that. Some countries are in the process of submitting that. That is the one of the primary goal, with the target that you have to reduce emission much faster and in a much higher rate of reduction, because the recently released 2024 emissions gap report by UNEP is showing that in 23, because the 24 report shows the 23 up to results up to 23, that in 23, global carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, that means carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, all greenhouse gases combined, if you convert them to carbon dioxide equivalent potential, the global emissions have reached around 57.1 gigaton. 1 gigaton is 1 billion tons. That is 5,710 tons of greenhouse gases we have emitted in 2023. We means the global human society. And with this kind of the way we are at present position, the projection now is that by 2021 the minimum temperature rise will be 2.6 to 3.1 degrees Celsius, and that's a very conservative estimate without taking into account many of the feedback mechanisms and the nature systems going into tipping position. So this is a conservative estimate that we have now with the present pledges and commitments, all the countries that have given, all the indices, if you collect them, and that exercise happened, started 2 years ago, which was called the global stock take. So one of the major targets and a negotiation point in COP30 will be implementing the necessary emission reduction. And that's why this COP30 is being called an implementation COP. That means we are not going to expect a lot of new announcement, lot of grandiose announcement, but whatever announcements have been done in the last few COPs, we'll have to focus on implementing those properly. So this is being called an implementation COP. So one is upgrade your NDCs, submit the NDCs by 2025, and those upgradation should be in line with a 1.5 degrees Celsius rise by 2025, 2100. But we all know that's no longer physically possible. So this is a very clear, the science shows that we have already passed the possibility of limiting the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. In fact, the last studies have shown that the temperature rise will be crossing 1.5 degree by 2035 latest. So there is no question of 20 on 100, it will be limiting to 1.5 degrees Celsius. In fact, present study shows even 2 degrees Celsius limit is not possible in this path unless the whole world changes drastically. So that's one. The UNEP emission gap report also shows that to be within any possibility of limiting that temperature rise, we'll have to cut down emission by 47% by 2030, which is just 5 years now. And we are still rising. In fact, in 2023, the global emissions rose 1.3%, rose, not went down. So, and this year we are supposed to by the way we are going, we are supposed to rise even more. So that is one major agenda, that based on the global talktake, upgrade your NDCs and submit those upgraded NDCs. The second major agenda of negotiation in COP30 is upgrading the climate finance pledges. Because as you will recall, the last year, after a lot of negotiations, the new collective quantified goal of the new climate finance, which was from 2010 $100 billion per year from 2020, which was upgraded to $300 billion, but with the caveat that it will be operational from 2035, which is almost meaningless. In fact, even the inflation will become from, if you calculate from 2010 to 2035, the inflation takes the money much beyond that. So $300 billion per year from 2035 is really a farcical sort of commitment or pledge. So the pressure is, as per the last year's calculation, the minimum climate finance goal needed is $1.3 trillion per year. That's the minimum. In fact, for energy transition alone, the IEA and UNFCCC, they have estimated, particularly the IEA's input, is that we need $1.8 trillion plus every year. But that's including commercial finance. So the climate finance goal, the developing developing country groupings like G77 plus China, like the least developed countries grouping, like the island nations, their grouping, all of them are pressurizing for starting a negotiation for this new collective quantified goal of climate finance to somehow bring in $1.3 trillion. But the problem there is now almost all countries are in position that this will include private finance, this will include leveraged finance, blended finance. So this is a messy scenario. So the climate finance is a major discussion point this year. And Brazil being one important point is the last 3 years COPs were all held in petrostates. That is countries which depend majorly on petroleum production, petroleum and natural gas production and sale for their economies, like Azerbaijan, Egypt, and this third country, UAE, United Arab Emirates. So all of them are petrostates. This is the Brazil also depend quite a bit on petroleum. It is a petroleum producing country, but Brazil at least has a much better position than a full petrostate. So a lot of expectations are there that this year the negotiations will have more space. The presidency, which is Brazil, they will facilitate more progressive negotiations and positions. So this is the second major negotiating point, the climate finance. In climate finance, there is along with that, there are two other areas, which is adaptation and loss and damage. As we can recall, in the Dubai COP, we also came to finalize the loss and damage fund, which is a separate fund from the green climate fund, which is separate from general climate finance, which is taken to be for mitigation, that is reducing emission and adaptation. Along with that, the loss and damage fund is now there, but there is very little money in that. Pledges are not coming in terms of actual money. So that will be a major target, major pressure group. So this will be, and this year's COP being in the city of Belem. Belem is within the Amazon. That means it's bordering the Amazon rainforest. So Belem being in the Amazon, the COP being held in the Amazon, there are problems that the Brazilian government did some deforestation. I'll not go into that. But being in the Amazon, forests and deforestation are in the focus. So one of the focus of Brazilian presidency is to focus on to push for global deforestation pledge to be implemented earliest, at the earliest. Many countries have not signed on, as I said, including India, but there will be a renewed push and renewed focus on stopping deforestation completely and maybe going into reforestation. So that's one, and there are some funds being committed for that. Some mechanisms, because this is an active, this is a implementation COP. The Brazilian presidency has proposed several methods, and they have proposed 30 key negotiating or implementation areas, and for each of them they are proposing, of course whether these are adopted or not will depend on how other countries react to them and accept or reject them, but the presidency has proposed activation groups for each of these 30 key areas. So this is a new push for actual ground level implementation rather than just talks and taking some decisions on paper, but activation groups on the ground where many countries will be members, and these 30 activation groups on 30 key action points will be hopefully operationalized in this COP. So in this COP, we can expect, given what is the present situation, not going into a negative or pessimistic frame, because many of the last few COPs have given us a lot of disappointment. This year, we are hoping that it will be better than the last three COPs at least in multiple senses, and this implementation of actual decisions will go ahead. The last point that I want to highlight is that Brazil being a democracy now, with the last government change, with Lula's government, there is much more space for civil society to operate, to protest, to bring up their agendas. So after many years, after Glasgow, this is the first time there will also be a people summit from I think 12th to 16th. There will be a people summit, and out of that there are multiple things like Amazon Climate Hub, where I have also a program, and there are many other activities happening. So civil society, people's movements, uh, ordinary people's voices who can reach there as a group, as a movement, as a larger collective, many of them will be there. So their voices will be, at least there will be space for expression. There will be a good people's march, climate march, that is expected on the 15th, which for the last 3 years were curtailed. For the last 3 years, the people's voices, movement voices were drastically curtailed and not allowed too much. This year, we are expecting that change too. So this is the update before the COP starts and before we go ahead. During the COP, we'll give at least two updates. both in English and Hindi. Thank you.